The rain drummed steadily against the wide windows of Brexton Café, each drop rolling down in streaks that blurred the city lights outside. Blake Anderson sat at his usual corner table. The leather of his chair cooled beneath his palm as he leaned back with a sigh that seemed heavier than it should have been. The day had been long. The kind of day that ended with numbers and contracts signed, but left no real sense of victory. At 38, with millions earned and empires built, success had become routine, predictable, hollow. He loosened his tie, ran a hand across his face, and told himself the bitter coffee would bring some measure of clarity. But even as the warmth of the cafe wrapped around him, a familiar emptiness clung to his chest. The barista had already begun preparing his drink. Without asking, the usual, "Mr. Anderson," she said with a smile, but he only nodded absently. His eyes weren't on her, or the glowing menu boards, or even the steaming cup sliding down the counter. His attention had caught on something outside, through the rain-streaked glass, where the dim orange of the street lamp cut through the storm. There, beneath the cafe's awning, a small figure sat huddled on the wet sidewalk. A child. Blake's brow furrowed. She couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7 at most. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her thin arms wrapped tightly around a small, warm backpack as though it was the most valuable thing in the world. The rain splattered close to her, dampening her dark hair until strands clung stubbornly to her cheeks. She wasn't crying. That was what unsettled him most. Children usually cried when left alone, but this one sat in quiet defiance of the storm, her wide brown eyes scanning the street with patience that seemed far too old for her small body. Something twisted in Blake's chest, an ache he didn't understand. Children should not be sitting alone in the rain at this hour, not in this part of the city. He pushed back his chair before he realized what he was doing, his long strides carrying him to the door as his coffee order was called after him. He ignored it, stepping into the damp air where the storm hissed against the awning. The girl looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her gaze was direct, steady, not frightened the way he expected. For a moment, she seemed to be evaluating him, weighing whether he was friend or foe. Then she tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it stopped him in his tracks. He didn't know why it struck him, only that something in it pulled at memory. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, crouching so his voice wouldn't tower over her. "Where are your parents?" She adjusted the grip on her backpack before answering, her tone clear, confident. "I'm waiting for my grandpa. He's late sometimes." Blake nodded slowly, though the explanation didn't ease the unease gnawing at him. Up close, he could see that her clothes, though neatly arranged, were faded and frayed at the edges. Her shoes were scuffed, her socks damp, yet she carried herself with a kind of quiet composure, as though she was used to holding her place in the world without complaint. "I'm Blake," he offered, extending a hand the way he would to an equal, not a child. She studied his hand for a moment before reaching out with her own small one, shaking firmly. "Madison Parker," she said with an air of practiced politeness, as though she had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times. The name hit him unexpectedly, like a pebble thrown at glass, small but capable of shattering if pressed too hard. He masked his reaction, but the echo of that surname stirred ghosts from somewhere deep in his past. "Well, Madison," he said carefully, "it's getting dark. How about we wait inside where it's warm? I'll buy you some hot chocolate while we wait for your grandpa." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing with a shrewdness that surprised him. But after a long moment, she nodded, rising with the same quiet dignity she had shown all along. As her small fingers slipped into his larger hand, he felt an unexpected jolt, as though something long dormant within him had stirred awake. Then her sleeve shifted slightly as she gathered her backpack, and he glimpsed the curve of her wrist. For the briefest moment, a strange shape pressed through the pale skin of crescent birthmark. His breath caught in his throat. He told himself it was nothing, just coincidence. Yet the familiarity of it clung to him like the rain still dripping from the edge of the awning. He didn't let go of her hand as they stepped inside the cafe. But his mind was no longer on the coffee or the storm outside. Something about this girl, her name, her composure, the mark on her skin, something about her was pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. The cafe was warmer than the storm outside, but Blake barely noticed the comforting hum of conversation or the smell of roasted beans in the air. His mind was still snagged on the crescent-shaped birthmark he glimpsed on Madison's wrist. It wasn't just similar to his own, it was identical. A mark his mother used to call the family moon, a rare quirk passed down through generations. He had never seen it on anyone outside his family, and yet, here it was, quietly resting on the arm of a child who couldn't possibly know its meaning. He guided Madison toward a corner table, her small backpack bumping against her side as she climbed into the seat across from him. The barista raised an eyebrow at Blake returning so soon, this time with a child in tow. But he waved off the unspoken question. "Hot chocolate," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. With extra marshmallows, Madison smiled at that, a genuine, simple smile that seemed to melt away the chill of the storm. "Do you come here a lot?" she asked as she swung her legs beneath the chair. Her voice was light, curious, but unshaken. "Sometimes," Blake admitted. "It's quieter here than most places." She nodded, as if she understood more than she should. "Grandpa says quiet is good for thinking. He thinks a lot." Blake leaned forward, studying her carefully. "And your parents? Do they think a lot too?" For the first time, a shadow crossed Madison's eyes. She stirred her fingers on the table, tracing shapes only she could see. "I don't have parents, just Grandpa. Mommy died when I was born." She spoke the words with a calmness that only made them heavier, as though she had carried that truth so long it had become part of her bones. Blake's chest tightened, his pulse beginning to quicken. He should have stopped there, offered condolences, and left it alone. But he couldn't. Something was dragging him deeper, pushing him to ask the questions that both terrified and compelled him. "What was your mother's name?" His voice was low, hesitant. Madison looked up, her brown eyes wide but steady. "Jessica Parker. Do you know her?" The name struck Blake like lightning. His throat closed, and he gripped the edge of the table to ground himself. Memories surged, Jessica's laughter echoing across college courtyards, her stubborn streak that matched his own. The last night they had together, before ambition pulled him into the world of boardrooms, and she disappeared into silence. He hadn't thought of her in years, not because he forgot, but because remembering was too painful. And now her daughter was sitting across from him, sipping hot chocolate, carrying his family's birthmark on her wrist. Blake swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "Jessica was very special to me." Madison tilted her head, curious. "Grandma says my daddy's name was Blake, too. But he went away before I was born." The world seemed to tilt around him, the edges of his vision blurring. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's an unusual coincidence," he managed, though his heart pounded like thunder. Madison's sleeve slipped again as she lifted the cup to her lips, and the crescent mark glowed faintly under the café light. Blake's breath caught. He knew he should let it go, but the pull was too strong, too undeniable. "When's your birthday?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. "February 12th, she replied without hesitation. "Why?" Blake's stomach turned to stone. February 12th, exactly 9 months after the last night he'd seen Jessica. He felt the floor drop beneath him, the air squeezing from his lungs. He masked his panic by leaning back, running a hand through his hair as if smoothing away stray thoughts. But the truth gnawed at him, relentless. Madison watched him quietly, her gaze sharper than most children her age. "Are you okay, Mr. Blake?" she asked softly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Blake forced a shaky chuckle. "Maybe I have," he whispered under his breath. Just then, the cafe door swung open, and the chill of the storm rushed in with a man in his late 60s, rain dripping from the brim of his worn hat. Madison's face lit up. "Grandpa," she cried, sliding off the chair. The old man's eyes flicked from Madison to Blake, narrowing with suspicion. His hand rested protectively on Madison's shoulder as if shielding her from an invisible threat. "Who are you?" he asked sharply, his voice roughened by years of hard living. Blake stood, instinctively straightening his posture. "I was just keeping her company while she waited." She seemed cold outside. The grandfather's eyes lingered on him with a cold edge, then softened only when Madison tugged on his sleeve. "He bought me hot chocolate, Grandpa. He's nice." The old man gave a reluctant nod of acknowledgement, but pulled Madison close, already leading her toward the door. Blake's heart pounded, his mind screaming at him not to let her go, not when every instinct told him she was his. But he froze, rooted to the spot, as Madison glanced back at him with that same small, polite smile. It was the smile of a girl who didn't know. She had just cracked open a millionaire's carefully built world. Blake sank back into his chair, his untouched coffee cooling beside him. Outside, Madison disappeared into the storm with her grandfather, leaving Blake staring at the rain-streaked glass where her reflection had been. and in the silence that followed, he knew with bone-deep certainty his life would never be the same again. Blake couldn't sleep that night. The city skyline blinked outside his penthouse windows, neon lights shimmering like restless thoughts in his mind. He had built his empire from the ground up, mergers, takeovers, relentless ambition, and yet nothing had ever unsettled him the way a 6-year-old girl in the rain had. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, Madison Parker. Her name echoed in his head like a haunting melody he couldn't silence. And the mark on her wrist, the same crescent birthmark that had rested on his mother's hand, that he himself carried on his skin, felt less like coincidence and more like fate pressing down on him. He poured himself a glass of scotch, hoping the burn would steady him. Instead, it only sharpened the questions clawing inside his chest. Jessica Parker. He whispered her name aloud for the first time in years, and it cut like glass on his tongue. The woman he had loved in college. The woman he had walked away from when ambition demanded all of him. Had she carried his child without telling him? Could Madison really be his? The next morning, he summoned his assistant, Rachel. Efficient, loyal, discreet, she had managed his world for nearly a decade, and he trusted her more than anyone. When she stepped into his office, she immediately noticed the shadows under his eyes. Rough night, Mr. Anderson? Blake didn't answer right away. He stared out the glass walls at the city below, fingers tightening around a file he had pulled from his desk drawer, an old photograph of himself and Jessica, taken years ago, both of them laughing, young, unbroken. He turned to Rachel, his voice low, urgent. I need you to find someone. Jessica Parker. Start with college records, old addresses, anything you can dig up. Rachel frowned. Jessica Parker, that's a very common name. Do you have anything else? Blake's jaw flexed. She would have been about 36 now. Dark hair, brown eyes. She lived near Lincoln Square after college. He hesitated, then added quietly, and she may have had a daughter, 6 years old. Name's Madison. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she only nodded, jotting it all down. I'll make some calls, quietly. The hours stretched painfully as Blake tried to bury himself in contracts, board meetings, negotiations. But for once, business didn't matter. He was distracted, every number blurring, every deal meaningless compared to the storm brewing in his chest. By late evening, Rachel returned, her expression careful. She laid the documents on his desk. I found Jessica's death certificate, she said softly. She passed away 6 years ago. Complications during childbirth. Blake's throat tightened, the words slicing into him like a blade. He picked up the paper with trembling hands, staring at her name. Jessica Parker. Gone. All those years of silence, of wondering, of regret, and she had been gone the whole time. Rachel placed the second document down, her eyes flicking up to his. And I found Madison's birth certificate. You should see this yourself. Blake unfolded it with dread clawing at him. His vision swam as he read the details. Mother, Jessica Parker. Father, Blake Anderson, his name. Clear as day. The room tilted. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of his desk, his pulse roaring in his ears. This is impossible, he muttered. I never knew. She never told me. Rachel stepped closer, her voice low but firm. Mr. Anderson, she did tell you. Maybe not directly, but she left your name there. She wanted Madison to know who her father was, even if you didn't. Blake's knees nearly gave out. He collapsed into his chair, staring at the certificate, his chest heaving. All his life, he had thought himself in control of his destiny, his empire, his future. But here, in a single piece of paper, was proof that he had been living a lie. He had a daughter, flesh and blood, out there in the world without him. 1,000 images rushed through his mind. Madison sipping hot chocolate, Madison's calm little voice, Madison's polite smile, and then her eyes, steady and unafraid, the same eyes Jessica once had when she challenged him to be more than his. Ambition. But with the shock came something darker, fear. How could he step into her life now, after 6 years of absence? What if she hated him? What if the grandfather refused to let him near her? What if he had already lost her the way he lost Jessica? Blake gripped the certificate so tightly his knuckles went white. He had faced corporate wars, courtroom battles, men who would happily destroy him for power. But this fragile truth in his hands terrified him more than all of them combined. Rachel's voice broke the silence. What do you want me to do next? Blake lifted his head, his eyes fierce despite the storm raging within. I want the truth. Every detail about Madison's life. Where she lives, who she's with, what she needs. I don't care what it costs. Rachel nodded, but her gaze lingered on him with quiet concern. For the first time since she had known him, Blake Anderson looked less like a billionaire titan and more like a man stripped bare-handed, desperate, and on the verge of something that could break him or save him. As she left, Blake sank deeper into his chair, staring at the rain streaking his office window. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside him. Madison Parker was his daughter, and the world he had so carefully built was about to be turned upside down. Blake's office felt more like a prison than a sanctuary in the days that followed. He was used to the rhythm of power, phone calls that could shift markets, contracts that carried the weight of millions, decisions that bent competitors to his will. But none of that mattered now. The birth certificate sat in his drawer like a live wire, sparking every time he dared to touch it. The name printed there, his name mocked the life he had lived, a life that pretended he was in control. In truth, fate had been writing a chapter behind his back for 6 years, and now the ink had spilled all over him. He couldn't stop seeing Madison's face, the way her fingers traced the rim of the hot chocolate cup, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. So achingly familiar it had cut through him like a knife. He told himself he needed proof beyond paper, beyond coincidence. Proof that would silence the part of his mind still desperate to deny the truth. That night, he picked up the phone and called one of his most trusted private investigators, a man named Collins. "I need you to run a discreet DNA test," Blake said, his voice low and measured. "There's a child, 6 years old. Her name is Madison Parker. I'll arrange for a sample, but this doesn't leave your desk. Do you understand?" Collins didn't hesitate. "Understood, sir. I'll make it happen." The plan was set in motion. Blake arranged for Rachel to quietly send gifts to Madison's school, under the guise of anonymous donors' books, pencils, small things every child needed. Inside one package, carefully prepared, was a soft teddy bear with a tiny hidden mechanism designed to collect stray strands of hair. It felt underhanded, even cruel, but Blake told himself he had no choice. This was bigger than doubt. This was destiny demanding certainty. Days crawled by. Every time his phone buzzed, his pulse spiked. Meetings blurred into white noise. For the first time, numbers couldn't distract him. Profits meant nothing, and success felt like dust slipping through his hands. All he could think about was the storm-haired little girl who might carry his blood finally. One evening, Collins called. Blake shut the office door, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I have the results," Collins said. Blake gripped the edge of his desk, forcing his voice steady. "Tell me." There was a pause. Then Collins spoke the words that changed everything. "Paternity confirmed. Probability 99.9%. She's yours." The room spun. Blake pressed a hand to his forehead, his breath shallow. He had known his gut had screamed it from the moment he saw her birthmark, but hearing it confirmed stripped away the last layer of denial. Madison wasn't just a girl in the rain. She was his daughter. But the revelation didn't bring relief. It brought terror. How could he walk into her life now? A stranger who should have been there since the first day she opened her eyes. How could he explain to her that he hadn't abandoned her, that he had simply never known? Would she believe him, or would she look at him with the same guarded suspicion her grandfather had? Blake's mind replayed that moment in the café when Madison had asked if he was okay, when she told him her mother had died the day she was born. He remembered the softness of her voice, the strength behind it, the maturity forced upon her too early. She deserved better than silence. She deserved more than a ghost of a father. The next morning, Blake drove to the neighborhood where Madison lived. The contrast to his own world was staggering. Rows of aging houses leaned against one another, paint peeling, fences sagging. He parked a block away, his tinted windows hiding him as he watched from the shadows. Madison appeared soon after, holding her grandfather's hand as they walked to the bus stop. She carried that same worn backpack, but she walked with quiet pride, not noticing the world's roughness around her. Blake's throat tightened as he watched her laugh at something her grandfather said. That sound had pierced him deeper than any deal lost, any boardroom betrayal. It was pure. It was his. He wanted to step out, to call her name, to kneel on the sidewalk and tell her everything. But fear kept him rooted. Fear of rejection. Fear that the old man would turn him away, branding him as nothing more than an intruder. Later that week, He tried again, this time following discreetly to the park. Madison sat on the swings, her legs pumping as she soared higher, her laughter ringing across the playground. Blake stood at a distance, hidden, every instinct screaming at him to run to her. But again, he didn't. He simply watched, frozen in the gravity of what he had lost. That night, the weight of it broke him. He stood at his penthouse window, rain slashing the glass, and whispered aloud to the city, to Jessica, to the memory of the woman he once loved. I didn't know. God, I didn't know. His voice cracked, echoing back at him in the hollow silence of the room. But deep down, another voice answered, now you do. And doing nothing would be the real abandonment. Blake clenched his fists, a resolve sparking through the fog of fear. He had lived his life chasing empires, building walls of steel and glass to keep himself untouchable. But those walls had collapsed the moment Madison looked at him with her steady brown eyes. He couldn't hide forever. The truth was no longer a question. It was a responsibility. And if Madison asked him one day, why did you go away? He would have to look her in the eyes and tell her everything. That thought chilled him more than any storm. Because for the first time in his life, Blake Anderson, the man who could conquer boardrooms and bend fortunes, was about to face the one battle he wasn't sure he could win, the battle for his daughter's trust. Blake had always believed that courage was measured in boardrooms and battlefields of finance. He thought it was in raising his voice at a negotiation table, in signing deals that shifted entire markets, in walking away from rivals with the smirk of victory. But now, as he sat in his car on the edge of a quiet suburban street, watching the flickering porch light of Madison's modest home, he realized how wrong he had been. True courage wasn't about contracts or numbers, it was about facing a child who had every right to despise him. A child who didn't even know he existed. He had spent nights pacing his penthouse, the paternity test burning in his desk like an open wound. 99.9%. There was no room left for denial. Madison Parker was his daughter, and Jessica, the love he had let slip away, had carried their child into the world alone. Blake couldn't decide which truth hurt more, that Jessica had died without him by her side, or that Madison had grown up without ever knowing her father died at last. He couldn't take the silence anymore. He stepped out of his car, his shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of years pressing down on him. The front porch light buzzed faintly as he raised his hand and knocked on the door. The door creaked open and the old man appeared, the grandfather. His frame was weary, but strong, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He recognized Blake instantly, his gaze narrowing into a glare. You, he said, his voice like steel. What are you doing here? Blake swallowed hard. I need to talk to you. About Madison. The old man's jaw tightened. You've got no right. Not after all these years. I didn't know, Blake said quickly, desperation leaking into his voice. I swear to you, I didn't know about her. Jessica never told me. For a long moment, the grandfather said nothing. The silence stretched like a noose, suffocating. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all you get. Inside, the house was small, worn, but warm. The faint smell of old wood and lavender hung in the air. Toys sat neatly stacked in a corner, schoolbooks spread across the coffee table. And there, curled on the couch with her teddy bear, was Madison. She looked up, her eyes widening when she saw him. Mr. Blake, she asked softly, tilting her head in curiosity. Blake's throat closed. He wanted to kneel, to gather her into his arms, to tell her everything. But all he could manage was a trembling smile. Hi, Madison. The grandfather hovered close, his arms crossed like a guard unwilling to leave his post. Say what you came to say, he muttered. Blake knelt down so he was level with Madison, his heart hammering against his ribs. There's something I need to tell you, he began, his voice breaking despite his effort to keep it steady. Something very important. Madison clutched her teddy tighter, watching him with those wide, searching eyes. What is it? The words caught in his throat. He had faced ruthless billionaires, hostile boards, entire rooms filled with men waiting to tear him apart. But this was harder. This was everything. Madison, he whispered, I think I'm your father. The silence that followed was unbearable. The grandfather stiffened, his face a storm of anger and grief. Madison blinked once, twice, then tilted her head in that same familiar gesture Jessica used to do when she was trying to understand something complicated. My grandma said my daddy's name was Blake. Madison said slowly, her small voice carrying more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. She said, he went away before I was born. Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching. Was that you? Blake's heart cracked wide open. He wanted to scream that no, he hadn't abandoned her, that he never knew she existed. But he saw the raw question in her gaze, the wound already carved by years of absence. Tears burned in his eyes. I didn't go away, he whispered. I didn't know. If I had known, I would have never left you. Never. Madison studied him for a long, painful moment. Then she asked the question he had dreaded, the one that had haunted him every sleepless night since he discovered the truth. Then why didn't Mommy tell you? Blake froze, every muscle tightening. He didn't have an answer, not one that could soothe the ache in her voice. He swallowed hard, forcing the truth past the lump in his throat. I don't know, sweetheart. I wish I did. But I promise you this, I will never leave you again. The grandfather's voice cut in, sharp and bitter. Promises are cheap. Where were you when Jessica was dying in that hospital bed? Where were you when this little girl cried herself to sleep? Blake turned to him, his eyes blazing with grief. I didn't know. Do you think I wouldn't have been there if I did? I lost Jessica too. And now I realize I almost lost Madison. His voice cracked, raw and vulnerable. I won't let that happen again. The room was thick with tension. Madison looked from her grandfather to Blake, her little brow furrowed in thought. Then, in a voice no louder than a whisper, she asked the question that pierced through both men like a blade. If you're really my daddy, are you going to stay this time? Blake's tears finally fell. He reached for her hand, trembling, desperate. Yes, as long as you'll let me, I'll stay. Madison's fingers tightened around his, small but fierce, as if testing the strength of his promise. And for the first time in years, Blake felt something shift inside him, something stronger than fear, stronger than regret. But the grandfather's shadow loomed over them, his voice like thunder. We'll see about that. Blood doesn't erase the years you weren't here. If you want a place in her life, you're going to have to prove it. Blake looked up, determination hardening in his eyes. Then I'll prove it. Whatever it takes. The storm between them had only just begun. The house was silent after Blake's vow, but it wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace. It was a silence thick with judgment, with years of unspoken pain, with the weight of two men standing on opposite sides of a little girl's fragile heart. Madison clutched her teddy bear, her wide brown eyes moving between them like a tiny judge in a courtroom neither had prepared for. Blake's hand still trembled from where she had held it, but her grandfather's words lingered like a verdict not yet delivered. Prove it. Whatever it takes. Blake left the house that night with his chest burning, his mind reeling. He had come hoping for acceptance, for the simple miracle of recognition. But what he found was resistance, suspicion, and an unspoken test he wasn't sure he could pass. The drive back to his penthouse felt endless, the city lights mocking him as they streaked past his car windows. What use was a skyline when you couldn't even hold your own daughter? He didn't sleep. Instead, he drafted plans, not business strategies, but something foreign to him. He arranged to send Madison to school with her favorite lunches, slipping notes of encouragement inside. He made quiet calls to her teachers, ensuring she had supplies, that her homework was never a burden she couldn't bear. He even arranged for the leaking roof of her school's library to be repaired, anonymously, because Madison loved books. But her grandfather knew. He saw the invisible hand behind the sudden improvements and hated the strings attached. One evening, as Blake pulled up outside the house, the old man was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, face carved in stone. You think money fixes everything? He spat as Blake climbed out of his car. You think a new roof and packed lunches erase 6 years of absence? Blake stiffened, but didn't back down. I don't think money fixes anything, but I know Madison deserves more than what she's had, and I won't stand by anymore. The old man's eyes narrowed. You were gone when Jessica needed you. I buried my daughter alone, and I swore Madison would never need another man who disappears. The words struck Blake like blows, but he refused to falter. I can't change the past, but I can fight for the future. I'll fight for her. The grandfather sneered, but before he could reply, Madison's small voice rang out from the doorway. Grandpa? Mr. Blake, please stop fighting. Both men froze. Madison stood there, tiny in her pajamas, her teddy clutched against her chest. But her eyes, though steady, soulful eyes, carried more weight than either of them. She stepped onto the porch, raindamp air curling around her hair. If you're both supposed to love me, then why do you sound like enemies? The old man's face softened, shame flickering across it. Blake's throat tightened, his heart breaking at the sight of her confusion. He knelt, meeting her gaze. Madison, I'm not your enemy. I only want to be here. If you'll let me. Madison studied him in silence, her little brow furrowed in thought. Finally, she asked the question that had haunted Blake for nights. Why did you go away? The truth cracked open inside him. He took a shaky breath. I didn't know about you. I swear I didn't. If I had, I would have been here from the beginning. I would have held you the day you were born. I would have never left you alone, not for a single moment. His voice broke, raw and unpolished. But I didn't know, and I'm sorry for every second I missed. Tears welled in Madison's eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stepped closer, her small hand brushing against his. Then don't miss any more. The words hit Blake like lightning, collapsing the years of emptiness into a single fragile plea. He covered her tiny hand with his eyes wet, his chest heaving with the weight of a promise he would die to keep. The grandfather's expression flickered, torn between resentment and the undeniable truth that Madison wanted this man in her life. His shoulders sagged as he muttered, "She's all I have left of Jessica. If you break her heart, Anderson, you'll answer to me." Blake met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I won't break her heart. Not now. Not ever." That night, as Blake walked back to his car, Madison called after him softly, "Good night, Daddy." The word wrapped around him like chains and wings, all at once binding him to her forever, yet lifting him higher than any empire he had ever built. He leaned against the car door, his body shaking, his eyes closing as the sound of that single word echoed through him, "Daddy." But even as joy filled his chest, a shadow of suspense remained. He had Madison's trust, fragile as it was, but her grandfather's suspicion lingered, and deep in Blake's heart, a darker question gnawed. If Jessica never told him about Madison, was there another secret buried in the past? The storm wasn't over. In fact, it was only gathering strength. The air that night was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, the kind of heaviness that made every breath feel like a weight. Blake sat alone in his car across from Madison's house, headlights off, the hum of the engine gone silent. He should have felt triumph. Madison had called him Daddy, the word he had dreamt of hearing ever since he saw the crescent birthmark. But instead of relief, there was unease gnawing at him, an unfinished thread dangling in the shadows. Why hadn't Jessica told him? Why had she carried the secret alone until her dying breath? The next day, he returned, determination stealing his every step. Madison ran to greet him, laughter bright and unburdened, but her grandfather lingered on the porch, his expression carved from stone. The old man's gaze followed Blake as though he were a trespasser daring to step into holy ground. Blake knew he had to face him. The truth between them was like a locked door, and tonight, he was going to break it open. After Madison was tucked in, her soft breaths carrying through the thin walls of the small house, Blake stood across from the grandfather in the living room. The older man poured himself a drink, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid swirling in the glass. For a long while, he said nothing. Finally, Blake broke the silence. "Why didn't Jessica tell me about Madison? You know I would have been there. You know I would have stayed." The old man's jaw tightened. "Would you have? You were a boy chasing skyscrapers, not a man ready for a family." Jessica saw that. She saw the hunger in your eyes for things bigger than her. She wasn't going to beg you to stay. Blake's voice shook, equal parts anger and grief. That wasn't her decision to make. She should have trusted me. The old man's eyes flicked up, sharp as knives. She did trust you, but she trusted her pride more. And I made sure you never knew. Blake froze. The words hit harder than any blow he'd taken in business or life. "You," he whispered. The grandfather nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under years of secrets. "She wrote you letters after she found out. Dozens of them. She wanted you to know. She wanted you to come back. But I intercepted everyone." Blake's knees weakened, fury and heartbreak tearing through him in equal measure. "You kept her from me? You kept my daughter from me?" The old man's hand trembled around his glass, but his voice was steady. "I buried my daughter, Anderson. I saw the way you left her behind when ambition called, and I swore I'd never let you break her heart again. When she died, I thought I was protecting Madison. I thought I was doing the right thing." Blake's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms until they hurt. "You stole 6 years of her life from me. You let me walk this earth believing I had nothing, when I had everything waiting for me." The old man's voice cracked, the first sign of regret bleeding through. And what would you have done, HM? Would you have walked away from your empire? Would you have traded your millions for sleepless nights and hospital bills? Don't lie to yourself, Anderson. You weren't ready back then. Maybe you're only ready now because life forced you to be. The words sliced into Blake, because in them lay a truth he couldn't deny. Back then, he might have faltered. He might have chosen ambition. But that didn't excuse the theft. The years stolen from him and Madison. Blake stepped closer, his voice low but deadly certain. Ready or not, I would have tried. I would have loved her. And you had no right to make that choice for me. The old man's face crumpled, his iron mask finally cracking. His voice was barely a whisper. I know, and every day since, I've lived with that guilt. Watching Madison grow, knowing her father was out there somewhere, and that I'd been the one to draw the curtain between you. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of revelation pressing down on both men. Then, from the hallway, a small voice pierced the air. Daddy. Both men turned. Madison stood there, her teddy clutched tight, her eyes glistening with confusion. Why are you shouting? Why are you so angry? Blake rushed to her side, kneeling so he could look her in the eye. His voice trembled, but it carried the truth raw and unvarnished. Madison, your mommy loved you more than anything in the world. She wanted me to know about you. She tried, but sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big ones, and because of that, I wasn't here when you needed me. He cupped her tiny hand, tears blurring his vision. But I'm here now, and I'll never go away again. Madison's lip quivered. She looked at her grandfather, then back at Blake. Is it true? Mommy wanted you to know? The old man's eyes shone with unshed tears. He nodded slowly. It's true, sweetheart. Your mother tried. I stopped it. I thought I was protecting you. Madison's small voice trembled with the weight of a child far older than her years. Then don't protect me from him anymore. I want my daddy. The words shattered whatever walls still stood between them. Blake gathered her into his arms, holding her as if he could make up for every missed birthday, every lonely night, every tear shed without him there. The old man turned away, shoulders bowed under regret, the sound of Madison's whisper breaking what little pride he had left. I always wished for you. Madison murmured against Blake's chest. Blake closed his eyes, clutching her tighter, the storm outside finally giving way to stillness. He had fought for empires and fortunes, but this fragile girl in his arms was the only victory that mattered. Yet even in the glow of reunion, Blake knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust had to be earned, scars had to be healed, and Madison's world had to be carefully rebuilt. But as he kissed the crown of her head and felt her heartbeat against his, one truth burned brighter than all the rest. The millionaire who once thought he had everything now knew he had been poor all along. Only here, with Madison in his arms, did he finally understand what it meant to be truly rich.